As you can see, for this final episode, we've left the building and we're going to be going over to Northern Ireland to Malcolm Johnston's home. Malcolm was a really successful businessman, but he used his success to set up charities in Eastern Europe. His influence has affected literally hundreds of lives. That's his legacy. I'm grateful to him for his wisdom and friendship in this, the final episode of Gospel Entrepreneurs.
Big in my life has been learning to live a double life. God called me very much into business. I love the challenge of growing something, being able to have vision, develop strategy, and then build something that worked. And I loved that. And our business was in the financial investment sector, and it was a great time to be growing a business in that field. The team just kept getting bigger, and God really blessed that. I grew up in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and during the Troubles. And God also called me to be in the middle of really difficult communities here in Belfast, and inner city ghettos with massive unemployment, huge violence and terrorism problems. And I got involved in kids and youth work in inner city ghetto Belfast. And it was really tough work, but God taught me to love those kids. I mean, they almost had they were determined to wreck what we were trying to do. And that made it difficult, but God taught me, I would say it took 4 years actually, but God taught me to love those kids no matter how bad they were. And I was learning to grow in that, and at the same time growing a business. So I had this kind of double life of caring a lot about people on the margins, people who were poor, who lacked hope, lacked opportunity, and at the same time working in a business that probably at the end of the day was working with well-off, wealthy people, advising them about their finances. And God, I think, blessed me to be able to go across that spectrum. But probably ultimately what I really enjoyed was working with those kids that were coming from really difficult situations. Very early in my walk as a Christian, when life was getting complicated, you know, the width of business and working with the poor, I was challenged by others that I needed to make spending time with the Lord in silence on my own as the food of my spiritual life. That had to be absolutely core. And if I didn't commit to the discipline of that, I was going to drift. So it was good to have all the other things that were spiritual nourishment, but that time committed to God in the morning, to get up early enough to do this before the day got going, that was absolutely pivotal for me. And that really was what shaped my priorities, and particularly the call of Isaiah 61 then became huge on my life, and really knowing God said, this is what's important to me. I benefited so much from other people and their legacy, you know, as they challenged me, influenced me, they were role models for me. The business was the Lord's, and so we gave it everything we could to grow the profitability, because that meant that we could do more and more really interesting things with the profits, as well as trying to do really interesting things with the business to be a blessing in our community. So starting to understand stewardship with the overflow from the business was really important. I wanted to put my time as well into things that I felt passionate about. So I felt passionate about growing the business, so I wanted to put a lot of time into that. But God also then opened up a whole lot of doors. Just as, you know, early stages, it was inner city Belfast, go and be involved, and I put a lot of time into growing inner city community work with other great people. So just after the fall of communism, so early mid-90s, God opened a door for me to go off into Eastern Europe as a pioneer. It needed that entrepreneurial thing of jumping into the dark, but God called me into countries that were in a real mess and challenged me with, well, what does the kingdom of God look like in some of these really difficult places? And so being an entrepreneur gave me the opportunity to develop the business so that it could maximize its success, but also to maximize the amount of time that I could take away from it to go and do other things that God had called me to, as well as business. And that just opened up more and more time. As the business worked, I had other great people around me so that I could be free to go off and be involved in what to me were Isaiah 61 things. So as I started going off into Eastern Europe, I realized that one of the legacies of the breakdown of communism was immense poverty with families and so many children living on the streets. And that just absolutely broke my heart as I watched what was going on all around me. And so using that entrepreneurial skill of saying, what would problem solving look like here? What can we do to help kids that are living on the streets? Ultimately, it was about trusting God to find the right people to work with in lots of different countries. That started in Ukraine, went to Moldova, went all across Russia, Belarus, other countries, working with great local people to try to build solutions for kids who were living on the streets. And most of that work with street kids started in Moldova. 20 plus years ago, we started to set up lots of day centres. But the kids that came first into the very first day centre, many of those kids have stayed friends. And I have a lot to thank them for how much they taught me about what Isaiah 61 meant. They taught me how to be friends with them. They trusted me they trusted me with their friendship. And that inspired me a lot to think, how do we build a model for that and then replicate it? And that's where I realized that kind of entrepreneurial thing in me, I realized that God gave me an amazing capacity to love individuals. And that has startled me all my life. The capacity I have to love more and more individuals and stay friends with them, but at the same time to think strategically. So if we can figure out how to begin lifting up kids, how can we do that over and over and over again? What would be a model that was scalable? And I think that's where that entrepreneurial thing in me, that, part of growing a business was, how do you build a model? How do you scale it? And so forth. How do you, help it to keep growing? And that was starting to engage with the churches in these countries. And we started to set up one day centre, 5, 10, and we built this model and it went all across Eastern Europe. So before long, there were 300 plus of these day centres, all picking up kids out of the dirt. But I was kind of intentional that I was going to stay close to some of them. So often with these kind of things, you become strategic and then you lose contact with kids and young people. And I was determined not to do that, because I realized that when I was out kicking football or, visiting the day centres, that's where I was most comfortable. I was most alive, I would say, when I was right there with those kids. And I never wanted to lose that. And so right now, lots and lots of those kids and young people are still friends of mine. In fact, yesterday, I was swapping messages with a girl called Tanya, who we helped pick up off the street when she was 7. And she just turned 30 yesterday. And I've come the whole journey with her. Her life has been hell in so many ways, but I've had the immense privilege of being her friend now for 23 years. That's the stuff that makes me rich. I began to realize that for these kids we were dealing with, our charity was great. We brought them into day centres, they felt better for a while. But I realized that their life didn't really change much. It made their suffering a little less severe, but it didn't change the trajectory of their lives. And I realized, and I think God really challenged me with this, he challenged me to put back on my thinking head. And I realized that what these young people that I cared about, what they really needed was not my charity going on forever, but what they really needed was parents with a job. And that was a real big challenge to me. And God really said to me, I've wired you to care, you need to think more strategically. And the challenge of God to me was what needs to happen for small businesses to start to be created in these communities to be able to grow so that jobs are created, so that the parents of these kids can have a job, and then the parents begin to change the trajectory of the family. Not your charity coming to try to pick up the pieces because the family has disintegrated. And that was God's challenge in my life is you need to think differently about this. And I was like, God, why me? You know, the challenge of running a charity in a difficult part of the world is immense. But the challenge to start stimulating small business and attract investment into the same places was just off the scale difficult. So I tried to find ways to run away from it, but God really said to me, if not you, who? I've put Isaiah 61 in you. You've got the experience of business, you understand investment. If not you, who? And I realized that I was not going to be able to continue this, run the business in one hand, travel all around the world, you know, go other places in the world, keep these two together. That was never going to work. And at this stage, I was kind of mid-40s. And I realized that I was going to need to sell out of the business to both create the resources and the time to really pursue what ultimately was economic development in frontier and emerging markets. I mean, that's really what it needed to be. How do we stimulate a new generation of entrepreneurs who had kingdom in their hearts, who could find the kind of investment that they needed? And so I sold out of the business and formed this thing called Angelo. And its vision really was about community transformation, but through what we would call enterprise-led development, not charity-led development. And being able to sell out of the business, which amazingly, the more time I took away from it, God kept blessing it. And the business continued to succeed almost no matter how much money we gave away or how much time I was away doing these other things. So I was able to sell out of the business, and I have had this immense privilege, I suppose, since then, to do what I feel absolutely passionate about, and that's be involved in community development in difficult parts of the world, but trying to pursue solutions for community development that are long-term, sustainable and lasting, rather than charity and aid-led development, which is short-term intervention. It's never going to build a long-term future. And that's given me the privilege now of being involved in lots and lots of frontier and emerging markets, helping local leaders to develop ecosystems out of which a new generation of entrepreneurs will rise who love Jesus, care about community development, they're generous, they want to see their countries on a different trajectory. And we get the privilege of working with amazing leaders in these countries. But the other part that I've still got this kind of double life. So a lot of that sort of work that we're doing with Angelo is very strategic. It's high-level leaders, national vision, mobilizing investment, all that stuff. But still rooted in me, what I most love and enjoy is working directly with young people. Me and a friend, we made a decision 15 years ago to allow us to stay close to young people. Somebody had asked me this question: if money was no obstacle, what would you love to do? And I always ask myself those kind of questions, but it came at a time that was really significant. And I realized when I thought about it, if there's one thing I would love to do was run a children's home, where there was a bunch of young people that I could just be really close to, who were coming from difficult backgrounds. I would love to just be immersed with a community of young people while God called me to go and do other stuff that was strategic, that I could always come back to this, that's where I would be rooted, and that I would never forget why all that strategic stuff is needed, so that at the end of the day, kids could get picked up out of the dirt. So we bought a house 15 years ago in Moldova, where I I'd seen a lot of the problems with street kids and so forth, but I realised that lots of these young people needed a safe place to live, to go back to school, and for them to really reach their full potential. So we bought this house and started to bring in vulnerable girls who were very vulnerable to being trafficked and all of that. And we started 15 years ago, and there's now probably 100 girls that have been through that project. We called it Oak House, which came directly from Isaiah 61. As it says at the end of that little passage, that they may be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendour. So we called this project Oak House. And as I say, now 100 kids have been through that. The girl that I talked about earlier, who just passed 30, she was one of the first kids to come into that project when she was 15, because her life was hell. And that has probably been the biggest source of joy for me, that while going across countries and doing strategic things is an amazing privilege, being close to those young people and being their friend and watching how they grow in terms of legacy, it's the ability or the privilege to stay connected to individuals, be their friends, watch the transformation in their lives. It's a huge privilege. At the beginning, that core was that spending time with God, and then realising that God wired me as an activist. So that was what fueled me, set me on my way, realising what was important to God. And I was like, okay, I'm all in. I'm gonna fight for what matters to you, God. I'm all in for this. And so God wired me to go and fight. I wasn't walking with God. I was dead in the water, because we were taking such huge leaps of faith into the unknown. And so drifting off from God was not an option, because we were massively out of our depth. And so God called me to go and be a rampant fighter for the kingdom. And that has probably kind of come full circle now in many ways, where being a rampant warrior is tiring. There's a bit of you that gets tired out, and there's a bit of you realises that you can't keep doing that forever. And it's maybe for others to then pick up some of that and do it. And part of what I'm trying to invest into is how to help others to come along and grow into that. And my privilege is then to go back and just spend more time with God. And that's been an interesting journey for me as an activist, to learn how to be more passive and to enjoy communion with God. Not just as fuel, but actually as a privilege of just spending more time in communion with God. And I wouldn't have imagined that could ever have happened. I thought I just need to be an activist all my life. And part of what God's brought me into is the privilege and joy in just communion with Him. Not just for fuel, but for friendship.